Now, if alien existed, would it destroy your faith? Really, I want you to think about that.
You are now tuned in to Beyond the Narrative with Will King.
Now let's take this one step further. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when reading Genesis is assuming it was written in like a modern history textbook. We often approach the Bible looking for like scientific explanations. How old is the earth? How many people existed? Or where exactly was Eden? What species were involved? But perhaps the writers of Genesis were trying to answer a different question, totally, just entirely different. Not how humanity was created, but why humanity exists. Not where mankind came from, but what mankind's relationship with God is supposed to be. Because if Genesis is fundamentally about humanity's relationship with God, then the existence of aliens changes almost nothing, correct? In fact, it may reveal what we've been thinking too small. Imagine for just one moment that intelligent life exists on thousands of worlds. All right? Would God cease to be God? No. Would creation become less miraculous? Probably not. Would humanity lose its value? No, at least I don't think so. A father having multiple children doesn't make any one children less important, right? It simply means the family is much larger than we actually realize. Perhaps God's creation is larger than we realize. Perhaps heaven itself is larger than we realize. And perhaps humanity has spent thousands of years assuming we were the only intelligent beings in existence because our scriptures are focused solely on us. Think about that for a second. The Bible is not God's autobiography. The Bible is humanity's story, right? It tells us about our relationship with God. Not necessarily every relationship God may have with every possible creation. And that's where I think the Garden of Eden becomes incredibly important. Bear with me. Because what if Eden was not merely a single location? What if Eden was the original state of Earth itself? Let's try to think about that for a second. Let's think about that idea. According to Genesis, humanity was originally given dominion over the earth, right? Not part of the earth. Think about that. The whole earth. Everything was available, right? Everything was abundant. Food existed everywhere and naturally, right? The environment was balanced, wasn't chaotic. The relationship between humanity and creation was harmonious, to say the least. There was no mention of like competition, no mention of war, no mention of like any scarcity, right? No mention of survival of the fittest, right? That comes much later. Everything functioned accordingly to the divine order, right? Now, compare that to the world we live in today. Just think about that. There's conflict, there's diseases, there's environmental destruction, there's greed, there's tons of violence, and there is isolation. The Bible says, after the fall, even the ground became cursed. The earth itself changed, guys. That suggests something much larger than a couple of people being removed from the garden, right? It suggests to me that creation itself was altered. Maybe Eden wasn't a place humanity left. Maybe that Eden was like a condition humanity lost. And if that's true, then the entire biblical story becomes like a journey back to Eden. Not geographically, though, spiritually, morally, civilizationally, if that's even a word. The Bible begins in paradise, right? And it ends in paradise, right? So the question becomes, what happens in between that time? Now let's talk about Adam and Eve just for a second here. This may be controversial for some people, especially some of you strong believers, but I want you to stay with me for a little bit. The Hebrew word Adam literally means mankind or humanity, right? So what if Adam is not merely a man? What if Adam represented mankind? And what if Eve represented womankind? Bear with me. What if Genesis is telling a story about all of us? Think about how often we see symbolic language throughout the scriptures, right? I mean, Jesus, when he spoke in parables. The prophets, when they spoke through visions. Revelation is like filled with like symbolisms, right? So why do we assume Genesis must be interpreted in only one single way? Could Adam like represent the rise of human consciousness? Could Eve probably represent humanity's capacity for creation and life itself? Could even the serpent, right, the snake, represent temptation itself? Could the tree of knowledge represent humanity's transition into moral awareness, right? Whether you agree or disagree with me, with these questions, I think it's worth asking because they fundamentally change how we understand the story, right? Now let's move to one of the strangest figures in Genesis, all right? Cain. We all know Cain, right? He was the first known murderer. He was first to be exiled. He was the first man driven away. The Bible says Cain was banished east of Eden, right? But here's a question many people overlook, though. Who was Cain afraid of? If only Adam, Eve, and a handful of his relatives like really existed, why was Cain concerned about being killed? Who exactly was out there? Like, who was he afraid of bumping into? Then Genesis tells us that Cain built a city. A city, not like a cabin, like he didn't he built a hut. No, he built a city. And for whom? These are like questions scholars have debated for over centuries after my research. And while they're traditionally answers I want to explore, another possibility. What if Cain's exile represent humanity's first great separation? What if there were groups of people who developed independently? Right? What if civilization branched into paths we know nothing about? What if stories that survived into ancient mythology or fragments of those forgotten histories? Again, this is just speculation. This is not true. This is just me talking. But if it opens a fascinating possibility, does it not? Now let's connect this to the aliens, right? From the beginning. Imagine humanity discovered an advanced civilization tomorrow. What would be the first question we ask? Who created them? And if you're a believer, your answer is probably the same answer you give to humanity. You'll say, God, right? So if God created them, then their existence doesn't challenge God, right? It confirms the creator's capability of producing life in other forms. In fact, I would argue that discovering aliens, life would be atheism harder for them to even maintain or dismiss, because we wouldn't have one astonishing civilization. We would have many of them. Many examples of different consciousness, many examples of intelligence, like many of life emerging throughout creation. Like that doesn't prove God, right? But it certainly raises the questions about design, its purpose, its intentions. But listen, let's even go a little deeper. Hold on a second. What if humanity's mistake is like believing we're the center of creation rather than being part of the creation? The Bible repeatedly warns us against pride, right? So assuming Earth is the only place God has ever worked, a form of cosmic pride. Maybe we are significant, but not like exclusive, right? Maybe we are loved, but not alone, right? Maybe we are chosen, but not the only thing God has chosen. And maybe that's the lesson here in Genesis. A larger universe doesn't make God smaller. It actually makes him even larger, grander. A larger creation doesn't diminish humanity. I don't think so. It highlights the incredible diversity of creation, right? The same God who created whales and hummingbirds and elephants and human beings could certainly create intelligent life that looks nothing like us. So let's return to the original question, right? If tomorrow aliens were proven to exist, would your faith disappear? For me, the answer would be no. My faith would become even stronger because I already believe in a creator capable of creating worlds, right? The existence of more life would probably simply mean that creativity is even greater than I even imagined. Right? Maybe Genesis is not a story about one man or one woman, a snake, a couple sons. Maybe it's the story of humanity in the whole. Maybe Eden was not just a simple little garden. Maybe Eden was Earth itself. Maybe Cain's exile was more significant than we realize. And maybe the universe is far larger, stranger, and more interconnected than we ever could imagine. The question isn't whether aliens would destroy faith. I think the real question is this: have we made God too small? Think about that. And let me know what you think in the comments. I'm your boy, Will King, and this is Beyond the Narratives. Peace.